According to 247 and Brad Crawford, who we like quite a bit, the most daunting home atmosphere should be Tennessee, Georgia. Otherwise, Brad, I might argue with you if this game were to be played in October. However, this game, Caleb, is a little bit different. So, raucous, you would think so, as long as Tennessee holds up their end of the deal, maybe have one loss heading into the game, but Georgia undefeated. That's kind of how you would predict it would play out. Yes, it will be the biggest game, most anticipated at Neyland Stadium in quite some time. Now, I'm not looking in retrospect, Caleb, because they won the Alabama game, they won the Florida game. But as far as a game in Neyland Stadium that there's been more anticipation for and will be if these two teams hold up their end of the bargain, you give me one besides Florida in the 90s and early 2000s, because I ain't got one.
No, it's not even close, and it's bigger than Florida in the 90s and 2000s because it'll be in November. Tennessee has played bigger games in November. Maybe. I don't know. Debatable. They've played maybe bigger games overall as regular season games. They've not played regular season games of this potential magnitude this late in November because they were usually playing Vanderbilt, Kentucky. Now, historically, there were moments where Vanderbilt, Kentucky were big deals. Okay, but college football wasn't as big in 1950 as it is now. It just wasn't. So it's not going to have – and Neyland Stadium did not have 100,000 seats in the 1950s like it does now. The only comparable game as a home game for Tennessee that we could ever remember was that 98 Tennessee-Arkansas game where both teams were undefeated. It was the latest at the time 2 SEC teams had been undefeated. But, Dave, let's be honest. You were covering the team at that time. Until the game itself happened, I think everybody thought Arkansas's undefeated record was a fluke. They didn't really consider Arkansas a top 10, top 5 caliber team, right?
You know, this sounds insane, but I felt like a lot of people going into that game felt like that Tennessee's luck had run out. I can remember the day of that game, getting the credential and having a conversation with a guy who still covers Tennessee. And we said, we just have this weird feeling that Tennessee's luck's going to run out because luck or good fortune, because the players hate it when I say luck. They certainly had that at Syracuse with the pass interference penalty. That was a pass interference penalty. They had some key turnovers that they forced against Florida. And no, I to be honest with you, when I go back to that game, I remember that morning specifically, and I thought there was a good chance Arkansas would slip up and beat Tennessee. So I felt like it was highly, highly regarded. Now, this is different. This is Georgia on November the 18th, where all you've got is Vanderbilt left. So even if you lose to Alabama earlier in the season, you've still got a college football playoff berth to play for. You might have a Heisman Trophy, which we're going to get into with Joe Milton a little bit later. So it's definitely the biggest since then. But if both teams go in with one loss, I actually think it's bigger than Arkansas because I think there are two factions. Most people thought Tennessee would roll over Arkansas, but there were a few that were like, maybe this team, their luck has run out. So, but I think this is the biggest since that one and might be bigger as long as both teams roll in with a combined one loss.
Oh, yeah, it's absolutely bigger, largely because it's a divisional game, too. It didn't, at the time, the Arkansas game, it didn't matter if Tennessee lost. They were still going to Atlanta. Whereas this game could decide who goes to Atlanta. And Arkansas was more, you're right, there may have been a fear that they would slip up, but a loss would have still been a slip up because no one considered Arkansas a top 5 national title contending caliber team, even though they were undefeated. Everybody thinks
that was probably the best year in the past 50 years of Arkansas football without doing my research. You're right.
Yeah, exactly. And everybody considers Georgia not just a national title contending team, but the team to beat to win the national title. So we're talking about, and it's a divisional game. It's a much greater magnitude. And just for good measure, it's 2 weeks later in the season than the November game, the Arkansas game was. So I think the magnitude of this November game, we have never seen Neyland Stadium like this, ever. You might have seen the closest to it, Dave, for maybe, were you there in that 1990 Notre Dame game? Didn't you tell me you went to that one?
I went to that as a fan. My stepdad, who I love to death, but I didn't love at the time because I was just mad because he was dating my mom. So, and you don't like whoever's dating your mom. But as an olive branch, he took me to that game. That won him a lot of points. We were in. I remember we were in the U section. I think it was. I can't remember which end zone. I want to say the South, but it was like watching the all 22. And that's when I realized they didn't want tickets on the sideline anymore. That I wanted tickets where I could see the all 22. I remember Rocket hitting a little toss sweep and thinking he's going to get tackled. He's going to get tackled. No, he's not. And he's gone. And it was just, that was Rahib Ismail. I mean, that team, there was more talent. I mean, other than the Miami games when they played Tennessee down there or up here in the 2000s, that's the most collection of talent that I've seen on a field between one teams ever. So a couple of people, to get back to Arkansas, Travis said I was at the Arkansas game and I 100% thought we would dog walk them, and Tennessee probably should have. They were a better football team. I don't think there's any question about that. But Arkansas, I thought, played Tennessee incredibly well, and we get to some of that in the Celebrate 98 series and some of the things that they were able to do, and they were smart about it. They slowed the game down, but ultimately you have that Clint Sterner fumble. But this will be bigger. Tennessee, Georgia will be bigger than Tennessee, Arkansas at 1998, assuming both teams go in with a combined 1 win or even maybe a combined 2 wins, because at 2, let's say Tennessee has 2 wins or 2 losses.
2 losses.
Two losses. You could still play your way into a college football playoff, theoretically, if you beat Georgia. Now,
LSU got to the BCS national title game with 2 losses.
Yeah. And you could still, by the way, hit that like and subscribe button so we can bring more people in. We greatly appreciate that. So, and the flip side too is Georgia and Tennessee could both potentially have a loss. So then you're playing for not only the SEC championship game, you're playing for a possible college football playoff, because there's going to be a team that's going to get in it at some point in the SEC with just 1 loss, maybe even 2. Now, some of the other games that Brad had listed as far as monstrous games, how close are they? I'm going to run down the top 5. Florida, LSU. I'm sorry, this doesn't compare to me because I love this rivalry because of the talent on the field. It's a game I go out of my way to watch, but this is not this is not to me of the same ilk of Georgia or Florida. What say you?
Oh, I absolutely agree. If Alabama were visiting LSU this year, I would have that above them because it's a November game in Baton Rouge. But since LSU has to play Alabama on the road, I don't really think LSU has a game that would have the magnitude of Tennessee, Georgia. So I don't think it's, I mean, Auburn, Texas A&M. I mean, what do you think? Dave, I don't think either of those. I think the bottom's going to fall out of Texas A&M, and I just don't think Auburn's going to be at a level where they can compete yet. So I just don't think it's going to have the same magnitude.
Agreed. So Jordan Hare for Alabama, Auburn. That's always a big game. I don't think that's a great surprise. And then you have Ohio State, Michigan, which is number 4. So Michigan would be the toughest place to play in that.
That's not top 25. Brad's totally wrong on that. The Big House is never one of the 100 loudest stadiums for a game in a year.
I agree with that. If that was at Ohio State, I think we'd be having a different conversation because that game is always big. And we'll get to Jim Harbaugh's suspension to round out the top 5. Beaver Stadium for Michigan, Penn State. Ugh. And then you get Tennessee back on the list, the Swamp for Tennessee, Florida, as one of the most hostile places, the loudest stadiums. There's no question about it. That's going to be listen, we talk about how Tennessee handled Florida, and it was a Hail Mary, and they almost got back into it. Well, here's the way they view it. They view it as our guys, Florida, almost beat Tennessee on the road. We're 1 pass away. So revenge game, absolutely no question about it. A huge, huge revenge game.
Absolutely. And they could actually say, even though you and I disagree, I actually agree with Billy Napier's decisions to do it. They could say that had Billy Napier not gone for those two times when they scored, Florida could have sent that game into overtime after recovering that onside kick. And so they were, to them, they were closer than it even looks. So, yeah, I think that they're definitely going to be rocking. And Florida really wants to prove that they've taken a next step. For Florida, it comes down to this, though. They have those early. Florida's got a brutal early start to the schedule. What will their record be when they face Tennessee? I mean, that's the real question in this one.
Yeah, and Mr. Jones had a point. AR is gone. Anthony Richardson is gone. And I don't think he was a great college quarterback by any stretch of the imagination, but you don't know him early in the season. How do you prepare for him? So I think that was challenging for Tennessee. I think they would have done a lot more of the muddle rushing, as I call it, to prevent him from getting outside. They talked about that early in the week, but really they didn't accomplish that goal. So I think Anthony Richardson last year, even though he wasn't a great college quarterback, Caleb, was incredibly tough to prepare for in September. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, but here's the thing. I always feel like the schematic coach has the advantage over you, and you tell me, Dave. I feel like the schematic coach has the advantage over the coach with Jimmy's and Joe's early in the season. Am I right about that?
And it depends where the Jimmys and Joes are. If the Jimmys and Joes are on defense, I'll take the Jimmys and Joes. But I see where you're going. If they're on offense, then I'll take the schematic coach.
Because the reason I say that is, for years, Tennessee fans, and you hear Fred White say this, they always say, if we could have just played Florida later in the year. And the reason I always felt was because Tennessee had the better players. Florida just had the schematic advantage with Spurrier. Whereas, okay, maybe they could have figured out Florida's tendencies a little bit more and their own tendencies a little bit more had they played them later in the year.
You and I may differ, and please don't tell Fred this. But I don't think there were many years where Tennessee was actually more talented. As talented as what Tennessee was shooting for.
The NFL tells a different story, though.
Okay.
Tennessee loaded the NFL way more than Florida during the 90s.